Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nadia Bureiko. I represent Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, Ukraine. Today, early in the morning, we had a very interesting panel on two sectoral issues, security and national minorities and cultural identities. Now we continue with a rather conceptual panel on sovereignty and integration. In general, this topic is quite widely discussed by both expert and academic communities as well as policy makers. How can we define sovereignty and integration today? To which extent did the understanding of sovereignty and integration change in the 21st century, in case if it did? How do sovereignty and integration correlate? What is the role of nation-state within the current integration processes? These questions bring us to the purpose of today's panel. We have three experienced speakers in the panel who will help us in searching the answers. They will share their vision on both theoretical and empirical perspectives of effectiveness of sovereignty and integration in the light of most recent trends in the international relations. I'm very glad to introduce the panelists. From your left to the right, we have Dr. Sławomir Dębski, who throughout his professional career has been closely associated with the Polish Institute of International Affairs, which he joined as an analyst and later worked as a research coordinator for Eastern Europe, head of research office and director of the institute. Between 2010 and 2016, Dr. Dębski was responsible for the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding, being responsible for its establishment and also being the first director of the center. He is also editor-in-chief of the Polish Diplomatic Review, and his area of expertise includes foreign policy of Poland, Russia, the EU, German-Russian relations and global security, as well as history of diplomacy. Professor Vasile Puskás, who was a member of both the European and Romanian parliaments and the Minister for European Affairs of the Romanian government. He is professor at Department of European Studies at the University Babeș-Bolyai in Cluj-Napoca, the director at Institute of European Research, and the chairman of Executive Education Association of the University Babeș-Bolyai in Cluj-Napoca. Concurrently, he also holds positions in research and cultural institutions in Europe. His topics of academic interest are international relations and negotiations, European studies, Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, international business relations, and conflict management. And Professor Maxime Lefebvre, who is a diplomat and professor in international and European affairs at Sciences Po Paris and European Business School. He began his career at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He worked for the French Embassy in Berlin and the French permanent representation to the European Union. Professor Lefebvre has held the post of Director for International Relations in the National School of Administration, Deputy Director of Policy Planning Staff at the French Foreign Ministry, Ambassador to the OSCE in Vienna, and Ambassador to Cross-Boundary Cooperation in the French Foreign Ministry. He has written several books and articles about European policy and international relations. A bit of housekeeping. I would kindly ask you to present up to 15 minutes your main perspectives on the topic, and then the contributions will be followed by the Q&A session. And without further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Dębski. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel, to this conference. The subject we are going to discuss is first very complex, very wide, actually it depends on each speaker to focus on some aspects of the problem of sovereignty. So in my initial intervention, I'm going to perennigrate travel between legal notion of the term, political and historical contexts. Because actually what I believe is that we in Europe have very different understandings of sovereignty due to our very different historical experience. So let me start from the legal point of view. International lawyers tend to understand sovereignty as a primary power, independence from others in external relations, and being subject of those restrictions that have been agreed. And I would like to draw your attention to the certain aspect of sovereignty from the legal point of view, which appears in the United Nations Charter in Article 2, Para 1. The organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. So it leads me to the very important moment that we should understand that all countries, all members of United Nations are equal to each other on the ground of international law. What is sovereign equality, actually? The question appears. I try to compare it with the principle of non-discrimination known from Article 1 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we can read there, I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in respect of their dignity and their rights," end of quote. We feel instinctively what the message is. Direct observation, even in this room or among panel participants, teaches us that people are very different. And are different in very different ways. However, as human beings, we are all equal. It is not coincidence that this principle was at the origin of modern political systems. Actually, what is an alternative? The divisions of better or worse human because of the shape of nose, skin, or race? No. So that's the kind of the achievement of our understanding of humanity and understanding of political principles we should stick to. It is very similar with the states. In terms of equality of sovereignty, the states are equal no matter whether a medium-sized country or even a small one. Bigger and stronger has no right to impose his or its views on a so-called, or create so-called sphere of influence, or believe that the countries that are in neighborhood should naturally share the beliefs of the larger partner. That's the principle of sovereign equality teaches. However, of course, we are dealing with the problem how states use its sovereignty, and the way how the states apply their own sovereignty or make a benefit out of it changes has been changing in the history. So it's evolving process. Circumstances change and states have to adapt to them. There are various concepts of sovereignty in history. Concept of sovereignty took various forms. The states variously justified division of power and variously identified its source. After the Westphalian peace, the dynastic justification was obtained by the territorial, was added by a territorial component. Then dynastic tribes were replaced by the will of nation. And since the 19th century, sovereignty is characterized by reference to the territory and the will of the nation. Will of the nation, that's another very important element in our understanding of sovereignty, because it leads us to the question of accountability. The will of nation is combined with accountability. So we can use, the state can use, democratic states can use their sovereignty unless there is a clear understanding who is responsible for application of the sovereignty and who should be blamed if this particular way of using sovereignty is regarded as a wrong one. So here I would like to make just a sentence which would help us to understand that in the process of European integration, nations use their own sovereignty, transfer or delegate part of responsibilities connected with sovereignty to supranational bodies. But still, this delegated part of sovereignty belongs to them, not to this supranational institution, because it is the part of sovereignty which was delegated, so delegation can be also withdrawn. And now we are dealing with the process of withdrawing this delegation in the context of Brexit. That's the way how illustration how the understanding in sovereignty may be used. This leads me to the third point of my initial intervention. I mean, differences driven by historical context, very different. Each nation's shaped the understanding of its sovereignty under influence of its own particular historical experience. So this historical experience shapes not only the way how the states apply their sovereignty now, but also the understanding of this process. We have very divergent, in Europe we have very divergent entities in this regard. We have the former imperial powers. We have the states which in Central Europe were created in the beginning of 20th century as a kind of the political contract, we can say it, as a kind of the political contract at the Versailles Peace Conference, 1918 and 1990. Big powers had a tendency in that time to perceive these small states created on the will of big powers as a semi-sovereign entities, established as a consequence of blood shed by soldiers of France, Great Britain, and United States. It created very interesting and very difficult political context for relations between France, Great Britain, and Central European states. Then, of course, we had the experience of a Second World War when the attempt to power grab in Europe led to one of the most tragic and disastrous war on our continent. In the end of this, we had again a political agreement on the ground of which part of Europe lost its sovereignty, not the statehood, but the sovereignty. Yalta Agreement, which is, quite widely understood in Central Europe as a kind of the big powers deal about the smaller states, violation of the sovereignty in the way how the smaller states had seen it. So the end of the World War II here in this Central Europe is widely understood as a triumph over concepts of sphere of influence, concept of powers, triumph of sovereignty over the dominance. There are just initial thoughts. I believe that during this conversation and debate, I would have a chance to deliberate on it much, a little bit more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your input, and also for being that much precise in timing. And we move further, and I give the floor to Professor Vasily Pushkash. Please.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be here with such distinguished colleagues, debating one of the most important topic of our time, and I'm sure of tomorrow, because we'll talk about history, about doctrines, but in the same time, I'm sure that our thoughts will be about future, talking about future. My intervention, my presentation is dealing with sovereignty and integration from the point of view of the contemporary international system. We are witnessing every day the changes, the troubles, the problems raised by the current international system. Since 1989, we believed that leaders of the world had a vision, had a concept of changing the international system. We only said, okay, bipolarity is over, but what's next? And I remember the debate within UN in 1991, which practically remain unsolved because after 1991, nobody talked about. Since 2001, so-called the group of new sovereignists came out with the debate about the sovereignty and the state, and of course about the changing international system. We are living today, we are facing the same debate. Jan Bremer recently said, okay, we are now in time of G0. Nobody is able to take responsibility, being a leader or a group of states or a power, to change the international system in order to have a clear way, a clear vision about the future of humanity, of societies, of states. In this context, the issue of sovereignty and integration came as a dichotomy. Is sovereignty compatible with integration or is not compatible with integration? New sovereignists, since 2001, said, okay, what we like to do is to restore, according with the doctrine of sovereignty, the absolute sovereignty of the state. But how to regain or install the absolute sovereignty in a very globalized world within so many integrative processes, not in Europe only, in Southeastern Asia, in Northern Africa, in Latin America, in practically all major areas of the world. From this perspective, I think that the debate on sovereignty is truly very, very important. But once again, it's important because it's related to the state. And because I did mention here the period after 1989, I am a mature, I want to say old man, since 1989. Yes, Marcos, I am. That's life. After 1989, everybody, and I'm sure my colleague from Poland remembers, advised us to take care that we are facing the time of ending the role of the state, so-called postmodern theory of the state. Fukuyama presented the end of history at the beginning of the 90s, but in 2003, to Columbia University, he presented a group of lectures saying, oh my goodness, it was a mistake. What we are facing now is a time of reinventing, rebuilding the state, because the major threat to the international system and to the international security is the weak state. And the weak state is practically the outcome result of a non-functional approach of the sovereignty and of the state. I would like to introduce to you another term which is very important and is related to the integration process: interdependency. Perhaps many of you are familiar with European integration. European integration is practically a system of multi-level interdependencies. Interdependency of states, interdependency of markets, of political parties, of social groups, and so on, so on. But from the point of view of the state, is interdependency a threat or is interdependency, let's say, input towards a new approach of the state? Alexander Wendt, I think, gave us an answer. We have to think how to change the state. Westphalian state, you disagree with, but what kind of state you need for the future? Perhaps you know that Joseph Nye wrote his Declaration of Interdependencies flying from New York to London. On the board, he wrote this Declaration of Interdependency. Interdependency is a reality of our days. We can say, okay, we are afraid what globalization is making. We are afraid what system, complex interdependency is making. But these are realities of our days. That's why, from the point of view of integration, I think that the issue of sovereignty is enriching, developing sovereignty, not weakening. We have to develop the concept of sovereignty. And perhaps Professor Lefebvre will tell us about this approach of President Macron, which spoke about European sovereignty. I'm very curious, and I have to say that I would like to learn and to understand better what President Macron believed and think about European sovereignty, because during the debate on the future of Europe at the beginning of 2000, a lot of people, a lot of states, a lot of politicians disagree with the topic of defining European identity and defining European sovereignty. And perhaps for this reason, some European leaders, politicians, directly or indirectly, practically destroyed the constitutional treaty in 2005. What means developing the concept of sovereignty? From doctrine of sovereignty, we have so-called domestic or internal sovereignty and international or external sovereignty. I think that the issue of internal sovereignty nobody will discuss. Everybody will recognize. What the problem is, how the states will manage the international relations, international system in the future, and how the states and non-state actors will act in a future international system. From my point of view, I think that the state will remain a central, a main actor within the future international system. Even the nation state will keep its characteristics. Sovereignty must develop the attributes in the line of implementing foreign, European, and international policies. From this point of view, I think that the states has a lot to do to change in order to be able to manage both regional integration and international integration. That's why my opinion is an optimistic one, not a pessimistic one, related to the state and sovereignty, and even for the concept of integration, both European integration and international integration. Thank you very much, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Professor, especially for being that optimistic in your presentation. And now we move to the third presentation, and I invite Professor Maxime Lefebvre to share your perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I will speak in continuity with both previous speakers, because as Mr. Debski put it, the basis for Europe is the Westphalian state, and also the adequacy between nation and state. It was a very important principle of the French Revolution, and later, during the 19th century, the principle of nationalities, which led to the birth of many nation-states, including Romania, for example. So it's difficult to integrate, by the European integration, to integrate these nation-states, these states, to overcome the principle of sovereignty. But however, we have a path from the nation-state to the European sovereignty, and that's what I would like to describe in four steps. First one is the fact that European integration was from the beginning a federalism in reverse. I hope I have put it correctly in English, un fédéralisme à l'envers. Federalism in reverse, it was an expression of Henrik Brugmans, who was the first rector of the College of Bruges, after World War II. So it meant that after World War II, it was impossible to achieve the political integration of Europe. The Council of Europe was a failure from this point of view. Also, the European defense community was a failure. And it was only possible to integrate Europe by economy, by the Schuman Declaration, solidarity of fact, by the money method, which meant, for example, the creation of the community of coal and steel, and then later on by the creation of the common market. So European integration as a federalism in reverse, as Rector Henrik Brugmans put it, meant that the European integration would not apply to the core of sovereignty, for example, to defense, to foreign policy, to tax policy, to issues of currency, monetary policy, to police, to justice. All these fields would remain outside the European integration from the beginning, but only European integration would apply to economy, to a customs union, a single market, a competition policy, an agriculture policy, a regional policy, environmental issues, etc. So European integration is based on this principle of interdependence that you described, principles of multilateralism, principle of globalization. It has to organize a global economy and to articulate a European market to this global economy through the importance of reaching growth, of reaching progress in trade. As Mrs. Dayton put it before, it's very important for security to have this growth, this economic growth, to share this economic growth. So this was the basis for the European integration for the beginning. But however, there was something very new in the money method, because it allows the European integration process to hit progressively the core of the state sovereignty. For example, coal and steel were basic elements for the armament industry. So integrating coal and steel industry meant making war impossible between the members of the first community. The issue of European law. European law was a supranational law from the beginning. In the 1960s, the European Court of Justice made important decisions to ensure that the European law would be superior to the national law. The issue of qualified majority, that decisions would not be adopted by unanimity but by qualified majority. It was introduced by the Treaty of Rome, but General de Gaulle refused that, because General de Gaulle was a traditionalist, Westphalian sovereignist. And this principle of qualified majority only started to be applied in the 1980s when the single market was implemented with the Single Act in 1986. So it took a long time. And also the issue of European democracy was very important through the creation of a European Parliament, which was elected in the universal suffrage in 1979. So you see that at the beginning it was a federalism in reverse, but however the issue of integration has developed also affecting the core of state sovereignty. Second step, the European integration has extended to some fields of the core of sovereignty. It started in 1970 with the European political cooperation in the field of foreign policy. It was something totally new, that the member states would cooperate in the field of foreign policy, would adopt common positions, common declarations, that they would have a system of communication through the capitals. All that was introduced after 1970. And also in the field of defense, there was an attempt in the 1980s to revive the defense cooperation through the Western European Union, the WEU. It was not so successful. If you read the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, this WEU had to be a kind of armed wing of the European Union. But it was not really successful, and only at the end of the 1990s, when the French and the Brits achieved the Declaration of Saint-Malo in 1998, it was possible to relaunch the project of a European defense policy through the European Union and not anymore through the WEU. So it allowed in 2003 the launch of the first military missions of the EU in the Balkans, in Africa, and elsewhere. So it was once again something totally new, that the European project, integration project, would also be a project for issues of defense, which was totally revolutionary. In the field of police and justice, you know that there was a Schengen Agreement signed in 1985. It was about suppressing the borders, the controls at the borders. It only entered into force in 1995, so it took a lot of time to be implemented, but it was implemented. And in parallel, there was the development of a justice and home affairs cooperation. It was the third pillar of the Maastricht Treaty of the European Union in 1992, and progressively this field of JHA was transferred into the community law through the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. So progressively this money method, this community method, was extended to this field of police and justice cooperation, JHA, which was once again totally revolutionary. At the beginning, it was only about taking decisions by unanimity. It was about having a restricted role of European institutions, Commission, Parliament, Court of Justice, but progressively the community method extended to these new matters. However, still today, you have some fields, some competencies which remain based on the principle of unanimity. I give you some examples. Family law is something which remains defined by the nation states and not by Europe. It's a principle of unanimity in cooperation. Operational police cooperation is something which remains ruled by unanimity. The volume of labor immigration, every state has the right to define its volume for labor immigration. It's not something which is defined by the EU. So you have still some fields where national states still decide. You know that in the field of asylum seekers, there was a decision about quotas to share, you know, the volume of asylum seekers entering Europe. It was, contested by Hungarians, by Poles, by many countries in Eastern Europe. But it is also a consequence of the Schengen Agreement, of the Dublin rules, where it's not possible to deal with these issues without a minimum of solidarity between member states. And of course, the last element where European integration has extended to the core of state sovereignty is the monetary union, decided by the Maastricht Treaty, implemented in 2002 with the new currency, the euro. It is really an element which traditionally is the core of the Westphalian state sovereignty, and which is now an element of shared sovereignty, with the European Central Bank being really a federal institution in the Eurozone. And of course, there are some common disciplinary rules about public finances. So I would like to make in a third point that the EU today is a federation of nation-states. This was an expression of Jacques Delors after the Maastricht Treaty. Federation of nation-states means there are some federal elements, but it means also that these federal elements are based on nation-states which don't disappear, which are still there, which are still powerful. Sometimes it's also said that the EU is a union of states and citizens, but I prefer this expression of federation of nation-states. The federal elements are the fact that the EU has some exclusive competencies in the field of customs union, competition policy, monetary policy, trade policy, fishery policies also, and the fact that you have some supranational institutions, some supranational law, and you have an important EU budget of 1% of the EU GDP, which is a very important budget, not comparable with the UN budget or with the NATO budget. No international institution has as many means as the EU, with more than 100 billion euros every year. It's very, very important. It's a very important budget. But at the same time, you have also some intergovernmental elements in this EU, foreign policy, defense policy, tax policy, economic and social policy. 40% of the GDP are public, transfers, but it's ruled by nation states. It's not ruled by the EU. And also the resources of the EU are decided by unanimity, not by principles of majority. So it's the time to decide about the future of the financial perspectives, and it will be an agreement by unanimity. Also police and justice, energy mix, for example, nuclear energy, it's an element which is decided by nation states, not by the EU. Immigration, nationality law, culture, education. In all these fields, nothing can be done if you don't have an intergovernmental cooperation, meaning the agreement of all governments. And if you see the last crisis that the EU has had to face, you see that you need this collaboration of the EU system with the member states. For example, the crisis of the Eurozone. There was an answer by the European Central Bank, which acted as a federal institution on the markets, but you needed also some financial mechanisms, some common rules defined by member states. In the crisis in Ukraine in 2014, it was the same. The EU was able to make some common rules, for example, sanctions against Russia, but there was also the action of France and Germany in the Normandy format to try to de-escalate the crisis. If you see the migrants crisis in 2015, there were some common rules, some common decisions by the EU, for example, the relocation of some asylum seekers, the reinforcement of the external control of the borders of the Schengen area, but many decisions were taken nationally, including the decision by Mrs. Merkel to say, Willkommenskultur, you are welcome, we open the borders. So you see that in many of these fields, national competencies and decisions are very important. And that's why, in order to manage the EU system, the role of the European Council is totally crucial. It is a central element, the European Council, which meets almost every month. It's like the collective sovereign of the EU, where you have the European institutions on the one side and the member states on the other side. My last element, fourth element, is about what European sovereignty could mean. Because it was mentioned and explained by President Macron, in particular in his speech of La Sorbonne last year, but in his other speeches he still speaks about this European sovereignty. This European sovereignty can mean a little more integration in institutional terms, in terms of budgetary means. But first and foremost, it's the necessity to act together towards the other big poles of power in the world, the United States, China, Asia, etc. President Macron is speaking of European sovereignty in several fields. For example, the field of security and defense. It's the first field where the Europeans have to act more as a European sovereign. He talks about protecting borders while adopting a common immigration policy. So in this field, integration may be necessary. He talks about foreign policy, external policy, in particular towards Africa, with a development policy, a partnership policy towards Africa. He's speaking about ecological transformation, climate change, food safety, with the modernization of the common agriculture policy. So in this field also, European sovereignty is needed. In the field of digital transformation, he says that we need European champions towards the GAFA. We need to tax the giants of the digital economy, the American giants in Europe. So he wants a European tax, which is not necessarily shared this idea by our German friends. And he also speaks of European sovereignty in economic, industrial terms, an economic and industrial European power through national reforms. This is national responsibility to make reforms, and France is trying to make reforms in many fields to improve the competitiveness of its economy, to make it more efficient. But it is also needed a European budget, and also a budget for the Eurozone. It's presently discussed in Brussels, this idea. President Macron also pleaded for more solidarity in Europe, for more democracy at the European level, against the tendency towards the so-called illiberal democracies, as was described by the Hungarian leaders. So, to conclude, I would say that a sovereign Europe doesn't mean a much more federal Europe. I agree with Professor Puksas that we need strong states. It's an important element for responsibility and for efficiency of our action. But we need to reinforce Europe, to act more collectively, to reinforce the institutions, to reinforce the financial means, the budget, which is presently discussed. We need a more consistent Europe, a more united Europe, able to face the other poles of power in the world, US, China, Russia, unable to meet the challenges of our planet. If you see the crisis in the transatlantic relationship, on Iran, on trade issues, if you see the crisis with Russia, about the Ukraine, future of Ukraine, about cyber attacks, about intervention in electoral campaigns, you see that this consistency, this reinforcement of Europe is more necessary than ever to meet these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have heard 3 very thought-provoking presentations on our very challenging topic, and now I really encourage the audience to engage in our discussion. We open the floor for the Q&A. Well, I'm not sure.
Many thanks, gentlemen, to all of you. Once again, let me introduce myself, Professor Roman Ementarashvili, Georgian National Museum, Tbilisi, Georgia. Well-known American movie director Stanley Kubrick once said that in international relations, powers, big powers, they're acting like brigands, like bandits. Small ones, like, harlots. You agree with this opinion? What forces these sovereign states to act in this way? What imposes their will, its will, on these states to act in this way? They are sovereign ones. What's the reason for? Thank you.
Do you refer your question to some particular speaker?
It's up to distinguished gentlemen.
I think what makes the powers cooperate is the necessity to achieve common goals, peace, economic growth, organizing the globalization. And so great powers remain great powers, but in an interdependent world, you need to cooperate. You need to cooperate in the UN. You need to cooperate through multilateral institutions. And in the case of the European Union, I think France, for example, still wants to act as a great power, for example, at the UN or as a military power when it is needed. But of course, we know that we cannot act on the basis of a total autonomy, of total independence. The total independence is a world of yesterday. So we need to act in this framework of interdependence, as Professor Pux has put it.
Sir, we define international system, first of all, let's say starting from Westphalia, in terms of power. Today, the international system is not defined only in terms of the power, but the power too. Today, the international system is practically the result of the nature of actors, and actors are not state only, nation state, but are and big corporations. And recently, analysis show us that 25 big corporations of the world are stronger, are powerful than half of the states of the world. 25 stronger than 100, if we're counting the number of states members of the UN. The current international system deals, even today, with a distribution of power. Distribution of power means relationship, interactions. Of course, we can account the power in military terms, financial terms, economic, so on, so on. But the real power means interactions, how the distribution of the power within the system works. And this distribution practically defined, and in my opinion, and today, the international systems. But adding to the power, I would like to say that is very important today, and the means of the actors to develop their interactions within the regional or global stage. And it's very important how states, governments, and not only governments, CEOs of big corporations are able to manage interdependency. Unfortunately, a lot of political leaders are afraid to say publicly and directly that their sovereignty is not weaker because of interdependency, but they are not able to manage their sovereignty in line with regional or global interdependency. That's a problem, and in my opinion, sovereign state is, according to Morgenthau, an actor, a legal actor. And he said Morgenthau is one of the fathers of realism. He said international law doesn't break the sovereignty. What breaks sovereignty is the quality of the law, international law. I had the chance and the honor to be chief negotiator of my country for the accession to EU. And I remember a lot of, let's say, small states within the European Union telling me during the negotiation process, hey, minister, hey, guy, you'll be strong when you'll become member of the European Union. But I said, my country is largest, is developed, has a lot of, potentials. And he said, no, you have to validate your potentials within the interdependent framework. That's a problem, not only at the European level, as Professor Lefebvre mentions, but that's a problem within the global system.
Let me approach to your question in the following way. There is during the legal classes and at the universities, or with when we train diplomats, quite often the question arises: who benefits most from the fact that there is a international law and international law system? Because there is a widespread complaint around the world that, however, we do have United Nations organization, we do have international law, but time after time there are states that violate this system, wage wars against other states, occupying their territories, and we are helpless, as the argument goes, in such cases. So my response to that is that, however, there is a principle of equality of states as a fundamental for international law, but we cannot expect from the system, from the very fact that we do have international law, that this system would not be violated by the others. Exactly as with our domestic laws, the fact that the law is adopted and exists, it doesn't mean that there are no individuals and there are no individual cases when this domestic law is not violated. We do have still criminals in our countries. However, we have all necessary provisions in our legal systems prohibiting some activities. Of course, this leads me to the issue of law enforcement. Yes, we cannot compare our domestic laws with international law system because there is no let me put it, there is no effective law enforcement. However, we have United Nations Security Council, but we are helpless in the cases when United Nations Security Council permanent members violate international law because due to historical development, they do have a veto right on the process of decision making. So, however, we can condemn a violation of international law, we cannot force Russia to withdraw from occupied territories in Georgia. We cannot force Russia from withdrawing from occupied territories of Ukraine, and we cannot do much in terms when the United States violate international law in other cases. Should we come to the conclusion that we would not need international law, because there are examples, there are cases when this system was broke down and violated? No, it is still good for majority of small, medium countries, and it is good for peace. And exactly this last point I would like to underline. Still, international community should first act. Condemnation is also the way how we apply our international law standards, and should put political pressure on those who are not in compliance with international norms provisions.
Doesn't matter, I give it a second.
Thank you very much for your answers, and we have a question right here.
If there one was earlier, then no problem. Markus Meckel from Germany. In the question of sovereignty, I think it's really a very, very interesting issue, because it's the question on which level we can solve problems. The people want that policy solve problems and gives their opportunity for a good life. And what belongs to good life? Welfare, security, the ability to go forward in personal and in social development. And I think that we have, when we see that there is so much objection today on Europe, European values and European integration in many countries of Europe, not only in the Eastern or Central Europe, but also in Western Europe, I see some regressive behavior and regressive thinking, because the world is so complicated. It is so complicated to solve problems, and people don't see that policy is able to solve it. As very often, then people become regressive to what they know. They know that national states usually solve problems, but we in Europe very often are not able to show that the problems of today can only be solved on the one hand via integration, on the other hand via cooperation. And I think this is what we have to convince people again. If I see what in Germany, AfD, or in other countries, similar movements in society, ask and tell about the policy. They usually speak about established parties, established systems. It is the same with Trump in the United States. Usually they think we are new. But if you see what they bring, it is very, very small. It's very little they really can do. And so I think our challenge is to make clear in which way the integrated structures on the European level can really solve problems. And if I see, Mr. Lefebvre, you told us the development of Europe. I remember in the beginning of the 90s coming to Brussels and to tell them what about security issues, because that was from the beginning a very important issue. And it was very clear in my own party, in SPD, in Germany, and even in Brussels, go away with security issues. That's not our job. Coming there with question of memory, with history. It was thought, go away with culture and memory. It is not our job to raise that actions, that questions, that will divide Europe. It was very clear there. But then, after 2004, when the new members came in the European Parliament, we had the anniversary of the Second World War in 2005, and we got a big debate about memory and the question in which way we should commemorate our history, because it's related to identity. And so yesterday it was said nobody would be ready to die for Europe. I don't think that is right. I have seen people in Kiev, in the Euromaidan, who were ready to die for Europe. Not inside of European Union. There are fewer and fewer who would do it. But in our closer neighborhood, people are recognizing, even it was at the Euromaidan, recognizing the importance of that power of European integration. And this, I think, is a question we have to get aware more and more. And from that point of view, I would ask, what is the role of national states in that field? I would be interested in your answers. What is the role of national states bringing Europe forward?
I would like to thank Markus Meckel about what he's saying about the necessity to act at the European level, because I think it's a right definition of what President Macron understands with the concept of European sovereignty. It means that Europeans has to act collectively in a certain number of competencies: digital economy, environment, climate, but also security, immigration policy, etc., achieving growth, many fields where Europe has to act collectively, and the right level to act is the European level. But beyond that, the nation states also remains important. in the field of defense in particular, the very sensitive question of the prix du sang, the price of the blood, you know, when people are ready to die or not in a military intervention. It's a very sensitive issue, which I believe, still has to be decided at a national level. When, for example, the German Bundestag authorizes or not the participation of the German army to some military operations, and when France decides, although it's not the role of the parliament to decide, it's a power of the president, of the government, but to decide a military operation where people will die, where soldiers will die, it's of course something which will probably remain for a while a national-based decision. But it's important to act also in this field of defense, of European foreign policy, of defense policy, to act more collectively, to have a greater interaction between member states and European institutions. And what is happening today, this development of a European Defence Fund, for example, or the capacity to finance by the EU budget some military research, not only civil research, but also military research, there are very huge progress. This is a very huge progress in the integration. These are practical steps, limited steps, but very important steps to reinforce the integration in this field of defense and security. And I think these are very welcome evolutions, including after in a post-Brexit European Union, to advance toward these goals.
Yeah, it's a vital question, and I don't know if we'll find an answer for that. In my opinion, both European institutions and government of the EU member states must provide with European public goods. Unfortunately, since 2004, we are not listening local leaders and the European leaders talking about European goods. We are talking about corporate goods, about individual private goods, and so on, so on, so on. I think that local leaders must understand that only in managing interdependencies they'll be able to solve local problems. And European leaders perhaps will learn or will understand that European public goods doesn't mean only growth of the economy, how the European Commission reports. From the point of view of the economy, the citizens are waiting every day growth and development. I think Barroso Commission was very much oriented towards corporate goods, not towards European public goods. And the answer is populism at the local level, populism, illiberalism, and a lot of, let's say, misinterpretation of the European integration. Marcus, I was very disappointed recently listening European leaders and heads of governments and states replacing the term of integration with the term of convergence. The term of convergence is very much connected to the market. We know very well. Integration, as Professor Lefebvre explained, it's a general term related to the society, not only to economy, to the market. That's why I think that we need both as a European level and local state level real change, a substantial change. And from the point of view of the state, because you said state, what nation state can do, or what does mean sovereignty in the contemporary age. We can define, and from legal point of view, Dr. Debski presented us, from legal point of view, or from operational, functional point of view, we have three levels of defining sovereignty. First of all, is constitutional. Is not a problem. Every state can define independence constitutionally. The second one is defining and implementing the rule of sovereignty. Depends both by the states and non-state actors. And the third one is the substantive of the acting in line with sovereignty and the interest of the state. First level practically is not very dynamic one, but second and the third one are very dynamic. One simple answer, what we expect? A very good governance. What does mean? Second level and the third one, which are very dynamic even today when we are, redefining the concept of sovereignty.
Well, the question gives me an opportunity to put my expert legal head aside and respond to that using a different one of political advisor. As you are a politician, I think this way of responding to the question would be much more effective. Politicians do believe that they produce common good, generally, everywhere. The problem is that the politics, the essence of the politics is to balance the effects of political action, because there are pros and cons, there are winners and losers of any political action. It leads me to the question of accountability, because we have to understand that politicians may produce also harm to some people, or sometimes by mistake to majority of people. Democratic system is based on accountability, and we may like it or not, people elect politicians, giving them right to make mistakes on behalf of the nations. The way how the process can be corrected is only through democratic, fair elections. This leads me to the problem how we can solve the issues which are unbearable for any single member state country in the European Union, in the way that the sense of accountability for the problem solving would be also very clear. And we do have this problem within the European Union. That's why it's quite common for all governments everywhere that if something goes wrong within the Europe, we blame Brussels. Because it is very difficult to catch the hand which actually signed this particular legislation. So it is a kind of the easiest scapegoat in Europe we have, and this particular trick is being implemented by everybody. It's not only by populists or, if you say, illiberals, but everybody. I agree with President Macron with when he says that we need more democracy in the European Union. we need more accountability in the European Union. The trouble is that, and here I disagree, that we can have both more democracy and more accountability on a European level. Because we vote for the politicians within our nation states. Yes, we elect a European Parliament, but again, we elect members of European Parliament within our national states. President Macron would probably not be able to win elections in Poland, or in Germany even. Well, here I have some doubts. Maybe. Chancellor Merkel probably would not be able to win elections in France, not in Poland. We still elect politicians within our sovereignty framework, within our nation states. So if we want to solve if we want to find solutions for the problems which are unbearable for single member state country, we still need to stick to the democratic framework put in our nation states. And we should enforce accountability for European level decisions on the ground of European Parliament, or nation and state parliaments, or nation state governments. Because here is the link people don't see sometimes. I mean, we vote for the government in our member state country. They do something in Brussels, but they pretend not to be responsible for decisions in the Brussels. So we need to re-establish this link between accountability and sovereign state, I believe. Thank you.
We also had a question from gentleman in the middle of the room, please.
Hello, my name is Dinu Gându. I'm from the University of Lower Danube, Galați, Romania. First of all, I want to thank our distinguished guests and host for the quality of these discussions. My question is starting with Professor Maxime Lefebvre, and I want to ask if he thinks the concept of Europe with two speeds is a real subject, and if it's close to be a positive answer, which he thinks are the countries who will support this idea. Thank you.
Which countries
will support this idea, this concept, if it's close to be a positive answer?
It's a difficult question because this idea of a two-speed Europe is a very old idea. You know, I think it was coming from the German debate when Wolfgang Schäuble and Karl Lammers proposed, you know, a small Euro monetary integration between France, Germany, and Benelux. They didn't want to have some Mediterranean countries in the monetary union. So there was this idea of a core Europe, but in France we like the idea of having less member states, to have some core Europe with less member states. But of course it's very difficult because when you start to say that, who would be member and who not? So the only real basis for a two-speed Europe is a Eurozone. Eurozone is today, I think, 19 member states. And the EU is 27 when the UK has left. So you still have a possibility of having more integration in the Eurozone, but in reality it's difficult to achieve because the single market is a EU policy, foreign policy it's EU policy, Schengen area it's beyond the Eurozone, so it's difficult, you know, to institutionalize and making systematic you know, the difference between two levels of integration. So I think President Macron, in his proposals, has more concentrated on the Eurozone, proposing, for example, to have a finance minister, proposing to have a parliament for the Eurozone, proposing to have a budget for the Eurozone. But as you know, this is not necessarily acceptable by other partners. So now the idea is more to have, for example, in the future EU budget, some specific funds for the Eurozone countries, but also for the countries wanting to join the Eurozone. So it's not exclusive, in fact. But it's always a very difficult debate. My personal opinion is that it made sense to think about a two-speed Europe as long as Britain was in the EU, because Britain didn't want to integrate into the EU fully, and also some countries like Sweden or Denmark are not really willing to integrate fully. When Britain is outside the EU, I think we should also say that at one point that Turkey should be outside the EU also. And then you have a more consistent European Union without the necessity of having a two-speed Europe. So, but that's a personal reflection.
Well, if we really do care about the future of Europe, we have to be very careful in supporting the concept, which, however, they sound sometimes very attractive, but may produce more harm than good. Because you know, in any decision-making process, we know that that there are. I mentioned that there are those who benefit and those who lose, and there are also unintended consequences. I mean, nobody intends to produce harm, but you know, in the end of the day, it happens sometimes. So, what we should ask ourselves is whether, and there should be criteria. Based on which we evaluate the concept for further development of our integration, whether it would produce or it would lead to better cooperation of states, or on the contrary. If we really believe in European integration and we really want to support the process, we should rather choose those concepts which would stimulate better cooperation among the states, that would enforce or help accountability, that would produce more democratic solutions, that would produce more democratic options. So, I'm afraid that all this concept of, you know, dividing very divergent Europe, because Europe is very divergent entity. We have the countries with gross domestic product per capita of $45,000, and we have in the same basket the countries with $25,000 of gross domestic product per capita. So economically we are very divergent. We cannot believe that all solutions we produce would be based on one-size-fits-all model. We cannot believe that. That's why we should rather very carefully assess new concepts of further development of integration. We have to be very careful not to produce more harm than good. because I believe that all countries, all societies participating in the process of European integration benefit out of that, and should have the sense of that they are benefiting. So that's the responsibility of the politicians.
Very briefly, I have to tell you not very good news. The 2-speed or 3-speed or 4, however, practically was put in the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007, which, entered in force in 2009. I cannot understand why people, and from Romania and from other countries, didn't react when Treaty of Lisbon was negotiated. I cannot understand. And they are react now. My explanation is that reaction is quite understandable, because some European leaders, including President Macron, speak about level of decisions. We had one decision-making process within the European Union. We'll have 2 minimum decision-making process levels. One within the euro area, and another one for general European Union. And this creates some, let's say, fears. I'm telling you, when I did negotiate the accession treaty of Romania, we did negotiate, and Poland and other countries, we did negotiate with France, with Germany, with all member states, based on the whole Europe. And the concept was the whole Europe, What the problem is now? Functionally, operationally, European Union works in a so-called differentiated integration. We have to deal with differentiation, but we have to deal and with competitiveness. Personally, I can understand Germany and northern countries, which are the most competitive countries of the European Union. But in the same time, I cannot understand why both Brussels and some capitals of the member states are not managed the European competitiveness, including Baltic states and Poland and Romania and other countries. Because based on interdependency, we have to find the way to manage and this so-called differentiated integration. But I told you, leaders of Europe don't like today to speak about integration, not about 2 speeds.
In his most recent book, The Road to Unfreedom, Timothy Snyder has written that the European integration has lasted long enough for Europeans to already take it for granted. He also writes that Europeans, and I quote here, forget the resonance and power of other political models, yet history never ends, the alternatives always emerge. I would ask you very briefly, in 2 or 3 brief statements, to share your perspective how the EU can ensure that the European integration project remains the most appealing and the most efficient among all the alternatives in case if they exist.
It's very difficult to to decide where to start, whether from Timothy Snyder, with whom I tend to disagree, I believe, or you know, the substance of your question. So I think that we should concentrate, and that's my instincts rather than, you know, we should concentrate in enhancing the sense of democratic process within the European Union. I mean, people should understand that what they vote for in national elections would also have consequences on the European level. And we should also accept the fact that people don't like the ideas or things or policies we do like. So we have to accept disagreement as a part of democratic process, and the competition of ideas. Because without competition of ideas, people would not have a choice, and choice is essential for democratic process. So, however, I appreciate very much the broad consensus in Germany about everything that has lasted for many, many years. It has its negative consequence in the sense that it produces thinking that if you want to be different, if you want to create alternative for the system, you have to reject this establishment views, be it or other emphasis of being against Brussels, against this consensus, against everything. I think that's the way how I understand why on the margins of political scene in Germany we have either extreme left or, on the other hand, extreme right. I believe that's the product of this consensus. Second thing, I think that we should give our national parliaments also the instruments and the way how the voters could influence the process of European integration, particularly on legislative level. And my third point is about majority voting in the Council. I do believe in democratic and political negotiations. Yes, they last very long sometimes. Yes, they are very difficult. Yes, all are irritated in some moment. But I think it produces less harm than the situation that some member countries are simply outvoted in the process of decision making, because it creates a problem for the government on their domestic level. And we would have a problem of democratic accountability on national level. How to solve it? Because, of course, not in all issues we should apply this moment of consensus, and we can stick to this model of consensus, having in place qualified majority voting in the same time. But we should give the preferences to these negotiations than to vote time after time, particularly in very controversial political issues, because more the controversiality in this process is, the more politically dangerous the effect may be.
I think that the European Union has to go back to fundamentals of the integration, as Professor Lefebvre mentioned. Cooperation, coordination, and convergence. Secondly, we need European policy or European policies for Europe as a local, not as a supranational only. Supranational is a structure. Tip O'Neill said the real policy is a local policy. How we'll succeed to internalize, I mean at the local level, European policy depends by the local politicians and European politicians. Third, for cooperation, coordination, and convergence, we need leadership, Nadia. Today, unfortunately, we have not a real leadership. A little hope came now with, is coming now with Mr. Macron. But Mr. Macron said, and I quote Mr. Macron, his approach is a pragmatic one. Look, from 2004, I witnessed it only pragmatic leaders of the Europe, and they fail. That's why we need a new type of leadership. We need a new vision of the European Union, and for both leaders and people to understand that the European Union and integration process, it's a dynamic one. It's not a static one. It's a dynamic one. For this reason, I think that we have, as a community and as a structure, I mean European Union, we have to focus on competitiveness, and not on European competitiveness only, but on global competitiveness. From this point of view, the main leaders of the European Union are right. But we are here too. And we want to be part of this competitiveness. I mean global competitiveness. Thank you.
I will answer very quickly to your question. I think we need both to achieve results and to listen to the people. Achieving results, it's through what Professor Puskas has described, through more coordination, through leadership, achieving growth, achieving more social justice, fight against climate change, achieving peace and security, stability. All these elements face the crisis and overcome the different crises that we have. This is a crucial element where our leaders have to act together and listen to the people, because we have to listen what the populists on the left side, on the right side are also saying, because these belong also to the red lines of the population, and in terms of social inequalities, in terms of fears about immigration, for example, it's also important to have this in mind, because otherwise some populist tendencies will continue to grow and maybe will lead to other countries leaving the EU. We could have some European Trumps throughout Europe. So it's very important also to have this in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists and also the audience. You really deserved a round of applause.